Thank you, Janet. If you are here this morning and would say that you are not a screw-up, then you are probably not a parent. And if you have children, regardless of their age, there are so many instances that you can probably think of where you're thinking, how in the world did that happen on my watch? Let me give you a few examples. At this point, we probably just had 3 children, and Philip was he was the youngest at that point, and maybe in the 4-year-old range, and Caroline had the 3 boys at the grocery store, and there's a lot that she's trying to navigate. She's got 3 boys that are moving about. She's looking at a shopping list of stuff that she's trying to get, but she's also trying to look through and think, are there any coupons? And then trying to look on the shelf to make sure that she can find it. You can't do all of that and pay attention to what's going on with everything that the boys are doing. And so she looks over and she sees that Philip, 3 to 4-ish, is chewing on something. Well, she had not given him anything to eat. There was no snacks that were brought in. And so she goes to open his mouth and to see what's in there. What's in his mouth? A Band-Aid. Where did he find it? On the floor. Let that one sink in. You're like, how in the world did that happen? But it's even more basic stuff that you're like, how could this happen? Let me just tell on myself in a few ways. Having so many children, sometimes I feel just in some of the basic stuff, I feel like a bad parent. For example, 2 weeks ago, I took 3 of the kids in different visits to the pediatrician. And like as other people are checking in and they'll say, what's your child's name? What's their date of birth? That type of thing. All right, so they ask me, what's your child's name? And then they say, what's your date of birth? And I'm like, and then I rattle it off. But I look like a bad dad, but I feel like I'm Santa Claus with the whole list. I've got to look at all of these dates. It's difficult to remember, but just honestly, this past week I had to take Andrew to the eye doctor, and it wound up I needed to call Blue Cross while I was there because there was a question with respect to a benefit, and our insurance had just changed starting in January, and so I called them, and so I've given them my information. They're asking about which child it is that we're talking about. I said, it's Andrew, and they said, what's his date of birth? And I said, this is his date of birth, and they said, that's not what's in the system. It took me a while to figure it out, but the wrong birth date was in the system. Do you know why the wrong birth date was in the system? I gave him the wrong birth date. I'm like, how did I do this? How did this happen? I feel like a bad parent. It was probably, in the past year and a half or so. It was on a Sunday, and Caroline and I drive separately to church because generally I'm among the last to leave. She's going to leave before I'm able to get out of here. But typically what happens is that we split the children up because most of the time 2 will come with me, 3 with her, and we'll trade off, that type of thing. And so on this particular Sunday, I don't remember exactly what was going on, but Nathan was supposed to ride with me, apparently. Anyway, I leave church and I get home, and we've been there for a few minutes. I have been there for a few minutes. There's a telephone call, and I don't remember who it was, somebody here at the church, and they said this, did you mean to leave Nathan? Of course. And you're like, how in the world did I do that? We're not talking about some random aimless stranger. We're talking about my own son, my own flesh and blood. This is somebody that I'd give my life for. Why? How could something so important, someone who means so much to me, how could I just so easily go off and leave him? But it is that very thing on the spiritual level that those of us, if you're here today and say, I'm a follower of Jesus, I'm a child of God, I've got a relationship with God, very easily you can walk away from this one that you say is so important to you. In fact, you could even be here today in church as part of a worship service, having walked away from Him. How in the world is that possible? Look with me in your Bibles to Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2. When you hear Luke 2, almost instinctively, you're going to probably think Christmas story, because Luke 2 is where we find our most well-known, often cited account of Jesus' entrance into the world. So Luke 2 starts off with, in the days of Caesar Augustus. By the time you get to verse 25, Jesus is 8 days old. But by the time you get to verse 41, 12 years have passed. So we start verse 1 of chapter 2, and Jesus is getting ready to be born. By the time you get to verse 41, Jesus is 12 years old. And much has been made of the silence concerning those formative years of Jesus' earthly life, what happened, what occurred. But the truth is, we simply don't know. This is all that we're told. And so there's 12 years essentially of silence until we get to verse 41. And we're told this, that every year his parents traveled to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When he was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom of the festival. After those days were over, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming he was in the traveling party, they went a day's journey. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all those who heard him were astounded at his answers and his understanding. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." And Jesus responds in verse 49, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know that it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Last week we started a series that I'm calling In the First Degree. And the premise of the series is pretty simple. Very easily we can get into a pattern of living, even as someone, or specifically as someone who says that you've got a personal relationship with Christ. And it's not that you never operate in Christian ways, but most of the time, that's not how you're operating. Frequently, regularly, you're not operating that way. Too many times, if someone were to see exactly what it is that you're doing at any moment in time, what you're saying, what you're thinking, how you're responding, what you're watching, all of these things, someone might very easily say, well, that person's a follower of Jesus? I mean, that's a Christian? And so it shouldn't be that way. I believe that the call of God on our life is that we operate consistently, and we do so with intentionality, operating as a Christian, that we operate as a follower of Jesus intentionally in the first degree. So we started this last week, but understand me with this thought. You will consistently fail. You will regularly operate in ways where your life and your choices and your behaviors and your habits, where all of those things don't look at all like that of a follower of Jesus when you have walked away from him. But again, how exactly can that happen? This passage gives us an example of it. And bear in mind what it is that we're looking at. Mary and Joseph, those who are entrusted with the physical care of God the Son, have left Jesus behind. Can we not agree that if Mary and Joseph could do it, then I could do it? Then you could do it? Certainly it can happen, and maybe it already has. But let's look at what happened with them. As this passage begins, we're described by Luke for us this scenario where every year there was this custom to travel to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. You probably remember the Passover is one of the big days in the Jewish calendar. The Passover was this occasion to be able to celebrate what God did way back in the Old Testament in the days of Moses. You remember when the children of Israel were stuck as slaves in Egypt, and God raised up Moses, and there was this whole series of plagues, the last of which was that the firstborn son was going to lose its life unless the blood was over the doorpost. Hopefully that is coming back to you. And every year after that, they celebrated the Passover festival to celebrate how God spared them, how God ultimately brought them out of slavery, how God ultimately led them to the promised land, how God did all of these amazing things for them. And so intentionally, every year they would seek to remember this. And it's obviously, it goes almost without saying, you're aware, not everyone lived in Jerusalem where the temple was. And so, when you have a big holy day or a big holy set-apart occasion like the Passover, people were going to make their way from where they were to Jerusalem. And that was true also of the earthly family of Jesus. Mary and Joseph, like any and every other faithful Jew, they were going to make their way back to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And we're told in verse 41, every year this happened. And so this is now the 12th time that Jesus has made a journey some 80 miles from Nazareth, where they lived, to Jerusalem. You're also aware that there's no cars, there's no subway, no light rail, nothing like that. And so getting physically 80 miles is going to involve a whole lot of walking, maybe a little bit of donkey or horseback riding, but still, it's not something that's going to occur in a day. You're going to have to break this up. Think also that it's not just going to be the family of Mary and Joseph and Jesus, but their entire communities. These Jewish communities would have sought to leave and head to Jerusalem. If you were physically capable, you were going to get to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. So, though Luke does not tell us this, it stands to reason that when Mary, Joseph, and Jesus leave Nazareth to go to Jerusalem at the outset of this journey, they're probably traveling in caravan with a whole lot of folks from Nazareth, a whole lot of other families, maybe some other 12-year-olds, maybe some other 5-year-olds, but just a whole mass of people making their way from Nazareth to Jerusalem. So they finally get to Jerusalem, and Jesus at this point is 12 years old. They would have been in town for a series of days, and after this was over, we don't know exactly how long they stayed, but we're told that Jesus stayed behind, but his parents did not know it. And again, what I said just a moment ago at the outset, very easily something like this happens as a parent, because there's a lot of stuff to pay attention to. And think about what's going on. They've got to get everything packed. There's probably a whole caravan of people, a whole lot of kids, a whole lot of busyness, a whole lot of commotion. Besides that, Jerusalem itself would have been packed with people. And there's so much busyness on this day when they're getting ready to leave, but they're going to start almost certainly with breakfast, and then they're going to head out. Jesus got up that morning, they saw that. Jesus had breakfast that morning, they saw that. There's so many people aren't staying together necessarily in family units, and there is this assumption Jesus is with us as they begin the journey, but of course Jesus wasn't. And so step after step turns to mile after mile, and finally it gets to the point where we've arrived at a stopping place. We've gotten to a place where we're going to stop, build a campfire, cook some supper, pitch a tent. We can't get to Nazareth in just one day. We're going to have to break this up. And so at this point, this would have been the likely time when families would have broken back into their individual units. So if you've got kids hanging out with kids, boys hanging out with boys, girls hanging out with girls, however it was, as this caravan was traveling, by the time you get to around supper time, when it's the plane's kind of landing for the night for families, it was at this point, where's Jesus? I mean, we're having beanie weenies tonight. Jesus loves beanie. Where? Mary, have you seen him? No, I haven't seen him in a while. Well, Joseph, when was the last time you talked to him? I'll be honest with you. I haven't seen him since breakfast. Mary says, you know what? Neither have I. And you can imagine what begins to happen. They begin probably to talk to other families that they knew, other friends, maybe other neighbors from Nazareth. Wait, have you seen Jesus? I mean, around lunchtime, was he with your family? And so it probably takes a little bit before they're finally able to get to the point where they realize, you know what? Jesus is not with us. In fact, it's entirely possible Jesus was never with us, that we left Jerusalem without him. And so how long have they been gone? A day. How long is it going to take to get back? A day. They get back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's not a small town. Probably the population is still swollen with this influx of people for the Passover. It takes a little bit to find Jesus. There's no Facebook to share his photo. There's no police department to say, hey, can you be on the lookout for this photo? There's none of that. So they're having to go around and search and see if somehow, some way they can find Jesus. And finally, they get to the point where they go to the temple and there Jesus is. And at just 12 years old, he is seated among those that are the teachers, the spiritual leaders of the people. And Jesus is right there with them. And they're talking about things. They're discussing doctrine and beliefs. And Jesus is listening. But it's clear also that Jesus is speaking, because it says that people were amazed not only at his understanding, but they were amazed at his answers. Do you know what you give answers to? Questions. Jesus is being asked questions by adults. And 12-year-old Jesus has got the answers, and people are just amazed. Everybody it is except Mary and Joseph. They're not the least bit amazed or humored. And so you can imagine they come in there, and just imagine the panic that they have been dealing with now for hours and hours and hours and hours. And finally, their eyes have landed on Jesus, and they come in there, and they're so glad to see him, yet probably want to kill him at the same time. Right? And so there's this relief, but there's this frustration. And the frustration is clear, because notice what they say to him. Why have you treated us like this? I mean, they're wagging their... This is an occasion to discipline Jesus. He's acted out of bounds. Why did you do this? Your mama's been worried sick about you. I have been worried sick about you. What's the matter with you, Jesus? And then Jesus responds, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know that it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house? Were you not aware? You know this stuff, that I needed to be about my Father's business. And I get it. Mary and Joseph are still trying to figure out. I mean, they had those incidences with the angels telling them about the miraculous conception of Jesus. Mary hears it first. Joseph hears it. There's how God worked in all these amazing ways. But still, for the last 12 years, Jesus probably seemed like a normal kid to them. Maybe had kind of forgotten just how special and unique Jesus was. And so Jesus is reminding them that he was here for a purpose, and it was that purpose that he had to be about. Nevertheless, you've got this when you take it down to brass tacks level. Mary and Joseph looked for Jesus because they loved him. They sought for Jesus because he mattered to them. He was not inconsequential to them. Yet this one that they loved, this one that they professed was so important to them, they had walked away from. Very easily, we can, through the lens of history, look back and say, well, I can't imagine how in the world they did that. Again, we've got the whole story. We've got the rest of the story. We've got all the details. And very easily we can look back and say, among other things, I can maybe imagine a scenario where something like that could happen, but to be honest with you, I don't have any connection with something like this. I mean, there's 2,000 years worth of history. We're not traveling with a caravan of people from our entire town, from one city to another. I don't know what any of that stuff is like. And very easily we can say, this has no connection with me. This has no application for me. But again, here's the thought. It is not simply possible. In fact, I would argue it's not even likely. It is certain that there are probably more than a few who are here today that if truth were told, though you're still sitting here today in a worship service in a Christian church, if the curtain were pulled back, your life hasn't looked very much like that of a follower of Jesus, because, and I'm not suggesting that necessarily you even meant to, but because you walked away. And this one that you say that you love, this one that you say is important, you've left him behind. You say, well, maybe. But I don't even know how something like that could happen. Based on what we see here, I think there's a couple of ways that you can see it at work. First of all, it can happen this way. when you don't understand this truth, that doing Christian stuff is not the same as doing stuff with Christ. I know that doesn't sound especially theological or formal, but hopefully you get the thought. Doing Christian stuff is not the same as doing stuff with Jesus. Now, this is a very simple thought, but it represents a trap that all too easily we can fall into. And the thought essentially is this: so long as I am not doing something particularly bad, so long as I am not stuck in the mire of egregious sin, so long as there's no sirens going off, in my life as a follower of Jesus, stuff must be okay. I mean, so if my relationship with my spouse is okay, if my relationship with my kids is okay, if my bank account is okay, and I'm going to church and I'm singing in the choir, or I'm teaching a Sunday school, or I'm just even faithful in going to Sunday school, and maybe pass out bulletins, I serve as a greeter, I help on I help set up tables, or I do all this kind of stuff. If I'm doing all that stuff and there's no alarms going off, everything must be okay. After all, I'm doing some Christian things. I'm doing some very religious things. And if I'm doing very religious things, then everything must be okay. Consider again what's going on in the passage. Are Mary and Joseph, have they been doing something religious? Absolutely. I mean, again, the celebration of the Passover, this is a big deal. You don't accidentally walk 80 miles. They've left everything, traveled 80 miles for a period of days, stopped everything to go do something very religious. Sacrifices would have been offered. Worship would have been rendered. Almost certainly money would have been given. All of these things have occurred, and they've done all of this religious stuff, but people who are doing something very, very religious, what winds up happening? Part of what they do, they wind up doing without Jesus. It's entirely possible that we can do something altogether similar. That in the process of doing church stuff, in the process of doing Christian stuff, we can essentially get disconnected from Jesus, and we get so busy doing stuff, serving, giving, sharing, laboring, doing all of this stuff, we can do so and know, hey, this is positive stuff, this is Jesus-type stuff, but even though we are doing that, it is entirely possible that we do so having essentially completely disconnected from the one in whose name we're supposedly doing all of this stuff. How is that? Well, it's simple. Again, doing Christian stuff is not the same as doing stuff with Christ. Let me illustrate for you this way. I do a lot of stuff that gets on Caroline's nerves, but let me give you one example. Most of the time, it's not always, but most of the time when we are riding together, most of the time I'm driving. And you're probably also aware, if you've been around me as well, if I'm awake, I'm probably also talking. And so we're driving along, and if she has fussed at me for this, she's done once, it's been 1,000 times. I'm driving, and as I'm driving, I'm doing this, talking. And again, if she's told me once, she's told me 1,000 times, I need you to look at the road. I'm not going anywhere. I can hear you. You don't need to look at me. Look at the road. You can talk. I can hear. You don't need to look at me. Haven't gone anywhere. Keep your eyes set. You don't need to look at me. I'll grant her this fact. That's probably good counsel with respect to driving. I get that. The problem is, too many times we take that same principle and carry it over into our spiritual lives as well. And so long as we're not hitting anything, we operate as though we don't even need to look in His direction. And too many times we're just not realizing that we have stepped away, that we've gotten further and further and further away. And it's easy to miss it when you're doing Christian stuff. So how can you tell? How can you tell if that's something that's going on? Do a little quick inventory. Think just this past week. Think this past month. How often is it that you are looking in His direction? And what does looking in His direction look like? Well, I think it has to involve that you talk to Him, that prayer is a part of it. That you're hearing from Him what He has said in His Word. That you're asking Him through the power of the Holy Spirit to say things to you. If stuff like that is not a regular part of your walk with Him, you're not looking in His direction. And if you're not ever looking in His direction, if you're not regularly looking in His direction, what very easily can happen is that you begin to drift further and further and further away, and you may not even notice it because you're doing Christian stuff. But doing Christian stuff is not the same thing as doing stuff with Jesus. The other way that something like this can happen is when you're oblivious to this reality. The right thing at the wrong time is wrong. The right thing at the wrong time is wrong. Before I help you see that in this passage, let me give you an example of what this looks like. I just talked about something that got on Caroline's nerves. Let me describe something that gets on my nerves that may aggravate you as well. Suppose you are at a restaurant, and this has happened to me over the years a number of times. Maybe something like this has happened to you as well. You're at a restaurant, the waiter or waitress has come over, and they have gotten your order. And whatever it is that you're ordering, let's suppose it's an entree and it comes with a salad. And so you have asked for whatever salad it is that you're going to get with whatever dressing that you're going to get. And so for me, it would be blue cheese because it's delicious. Anyway, so you've ordered the entree, you've ordered the salad. And so the waiter, the waitress, they've gone off to key that in, do whatever it is that they have to do. And so the moments begin to pass. And you're kind of looking around, you're seeing if other people have been served. You still haven't gotten anything. And you're thinking at some point they're going to show up here with this salad. Still waiting. And then all of a sudden you see the waiter, you see the waitress headed towards your table, and they've got a tray with all this food. And you're like, oh yeah, good, that's our food. And then they set down in front of you the entree, and then they hand you also the salad. Let me ask you this. What's wrong with that picture? Everything. Everything is wrong with that picture. I think there's a Bible verse that says the salad has to come out first. It is enormously frustrating to me when it shows up at the same time because I want to be able to eat the salad, kind of finish with that, and then the other things show up. But when it shows, because if I eat the entree first, because I want to do that because that's hot, I may not finish the salad and I might miss out on, I want to get full from everything. And it has to be in order. Salad first, then entree. Anything else, it's wrong. All right? Let me ask you this. Is it wrong that do I think it's wrong that the salad and entree come out? No. Is it wrong that the salad and entree get placed on my table in front of me? No, that's exactly what I want. I want that, but I don't want it at just any old time. The right thing at the wrong time is wrong. Now, I say all that kind of in jest with respect to salad and entrees at a restaurant. But there is, I believe sincerely, a spiritual parallel to that, which is that there are things that God wants us to do. There are things that are right, but if they are done at the wrong time, the right thing can become wrong. How do you see that in this passage? Look what's going on. We're told that verse 46 so they have found Jesus. Let's back up just a moment. Verse 43, after those days were over, so they have been to Jerusalem, they've been celebrating the Passover, they've been worshiping, they've been giving, they've been sacrificing, they've been remembering, they've been honoring, they've been doing all of this stuff. And so now the Passover festival is over, and what are they going to do? They're going to return home. Is going back home a good thing? Well, yes, because they don't live in Jerusalem. They don't have a place to stay. Going back home is a good thing. And they head back home. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is they head back without Jesus. Why? Because Jesus isn't done. There's still stuff that Jesus needs to accomplish while He's there. The problem is not going back home. The problem is going back home now. Again, the principle is this: timing matters. And doing the right thing at the wrong time is still wrong. They wind up leaving Jesus not because they've done a bad thing, but because they were doing a good thing at the wrong time. Just assuming, well, I guess Jesus is with us, assuming Jesus is done, assuming there's nothing else that He needs to accomplish. And very easily, we can do exactly the same thing. It could be that God puts a burden on your heart that maybe you've got too much going on, that you need to step back from some stuff. But you can step back too quickly so that the wheels of things that He wanted you to be about, that those things fall off. It could be that God is leading you to make a particular decision, and He's beginning to make that clear, to go down a particular path. But sometimes we can act presumptuously, or act hastily, and do it too soon, or we can do it too late and mess everything up. Again, the principle is this: timing matters. And doing the right thing at the wrong time, well, it's still wrong. They didn't do something bad in going home. They just went home at the wrong time. And doing so at the wrong time led them to do it without Jesus. Very easily, we can look at this passage through the lens of hindsight and say, among other things, I can't believe Mary and Joseph. I mean, sincerely. I mean, you're in a big city that is swollen with population because of the Passover. And you're gone for an entire day before you notice your own son's not with you. I don't know how far it is that you can travel in a day, but it's more than a few miles. How in the world could that happen? But then once you discover, and then you go back, and then they're going to fuss at Jesus. Who gets to fuss at Jesus? Why did you do this to us? Why did you cause us this stress? They're wagging their fingers at Jesus. And very easily we can look back and say, shame, shame on Mary and Joseph. Can't believe that they would do something like that. And there's all this stuff that we could say, well, they acted out of bounds with respect to these particular details. But there is something that Mary and Joseph in this passage do that is amazingly good, is amazingly positive, and is a profoundly good example that in the process of all of this we can very easily miss. Mary and Joseph, how long were they gone from Jesus? One day. In fact, less than a day. It was from morning, probably sometime after breakfast, till, let's say, around supper time. Less than a day. But what happened? They discovered we're operating without Jesus. And what did they do? They hightailed it back. And what does that decision communicate? It communicates this reality. Nothing else matters. Nothing else matters if I'm doing it without Him. Nothing else matters. It doesn't make any difference if we get back to Nazareth or not. It doesn't make any difference if we finish supper or not. It doesn't make any difference if the neighbors go on. Nothing else matters if whatever it is that we're doing it without Jesus. Could it be that if the curtain is pulled back and the truth about your choices and how you've been operating is revealed, it hasn't looked much like you're a follower of Jesus? Maybe here, maybe during this time, but on a Tuesday afternoon, on a Thursday night, a Saturday morning, doesn't look very much like Jesus. And it's very possible that the reason that all of that has occurred is because you didn't mean to, but you walked away. You walked away. Mary and Joseph operated this way. If we don't have Him, nothing else matters. We wind up walking away when something else matters. Will you bow your heads with me? The invitation today is very simple. Jesus is not seeking to come to you. He's waiting for you to come back to Him. Will you decide, will you choose that getting reconnected with Him, that by comparison nothing else matters? Will you ask Him to help you keep Him as the priority? Will you ask Him to help you get to the point where, like Mary and Joseph, if I don't have Jesus with me, nothing else matters? Will you do that this morning? That's for those who say, I've got a relationship with Jesus. He matters to me. He matters to me a lot. But God's helped me to see that I've stepped away. And I don't want it to be that way. I don't want to go one more step. I don't want to go one more day. I don't want to go through one more service. I don't want to go through one more day of school, one more day of work. I don't do any of this without Him. You can decide that today. But it's possible that you're here and you would say, you know what, I can't truthfully communicate that I believe or I have any certainty that I have a relationship with Him at all. I know things about Him, to be sure. I'm familiar with His story, but I can't say that I've got a personal connection with Jesus. Let me just say to you that you can have that. It's a possibility. So many in this room have already experienced it, and it's made real changes, not only in where they're going to spend eternity, but their lives right now. In just a moment, we're going to have a time of decision where you can make choices that God, through His Spirit, is guiding you to make. You can do that right where you are. You can do that even now as I'm speaking. But maybe you would like to come and kneel at this altar. And I'm not suggesting that this is sacred real estate, but I am suggesting that there is sometimes something very special that helps solidify our decisions just in kneeling in God's presence. Maybe you need somebody to pray with you. Maybe you'd like to share with me, Michael, I'd like to have what it is that you're talking about. This is your opportunity. Will you come? Will you share that with me? If you're afraid to do that, find me afterwards. Will you let me share with you something that can change the rest of your life? Father, thank you for giving us this example of what very easily we can say, well, that's bad parenting. How could something like that happen? But if Mary and Joseph could walk away from Jesus, absolutely I can. Every person in this room can. And there's some that would be honest right now and say, that's me. That's me. And Lord, you're giving them an invitation to come back. You're giving them an opportunity to realize that life without you, whatever that life entails, if it's done without you, none of that stuff ultimately matters. And so, Lord, every decision you're guiding us to make today, I pray that we'll follow your lead. We ask this of you in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to ask if you would to stand. Our praise team is going to lead us in the hymn of